You're listening to Words and Music, an audio series exploring the life and work of Indiana writers. The nonprofit arts and humanities organization Big Car Collaborative produces this show, and it airs first on 99.1 WQRT LP, Indianapolis. Words and Music is made possible thanks to a grant from Indiana Humanities. I'm Jim Walker, a poet, artist, and co-founder of Big Car. I was born in Kokomo, Indiana, and I've lived most of my life in this state. I'll be your guide through this episode that considers the Hoosier State's physical, emotional, creative, and social landscape through the lens of In the Heart of the Country, a boundary-pushing story by William Gass. Gass, who was born in Fargo, North Dakota, taught philosophy at Purdue University from 1955 to 1969. This story was part of a collection of short works, also called In the Heart of the Country, published in 1968, the year I was born. When I first read it in the 2000s, I looked up Gass on the internet and emailed him to ask which town it was about. He just identifies it with a B and 3 dots at the start of the story. I wondered if it was a small town where my family is from outside of West Lafayette. Gass wrote back a day or two later and told me the name of the real town where he lived and wrote. And he also added that, looking back, Indiana wasn't so bad. Gass died in 2017. To explore both this story by Gass and what it means to be a writer in Indiana, I'm joined by Hoosier authors Susan Neville, Adrian Matejka, and Kevin McKelvey. You'll hear a conversation with them in just a minute. First, Susan introduces In the Heart of the Country.
When a group of poets get together and have perhaps had a bit to drink or whatever, and they're out walking during a conference, I've seen this happen. One of them might say a line from a poem or just a line that happens to appear in a poem, and between them they're saying the whole darn thing from memory. What do I know becomes all of those winter Sundays, or suddenly someone's reciting all of Howl from one line. I've always been jealous of this, the way the music of poetry gets inside you like that, and how poets share that music. It's the community and also evidence of the rhythms they've all had to draw on in their own writing. Non-poets experience it when everyone in a car starts belting out a popular song. One of my best memories is of walking through New Harmony, Indiana with novelist Elizabeth Stuckey French and singing every word of songs from musicals we hadn't thought of in years. Oklahoma, where the wind comes whistling across the plains, we sang at the top of our lungs as we walked down streets of sleeping houses. We were so obnoxious, ending up in the Yellow Tavern finally, singing Copperhead Road along with the jukebox and memoirist Jim McGarrah. I mention this only to say how common it is, how joyful, and also how oddly uncommon it would be for a group of fiction writers to have an entire short story memorized between them. It's not generally something that we do. Reading fiction is a silent, non-communal act usually. And yet, several times I've been in a group of Midwestern fiction writers when one of us will start talking about the first time we read William Gass in the Heart of the Country. For those of us in a certain generation, it was formative. You could engage with modernism, you could experiment, you could write well and honestly, and still write about a place that was recognizably the Midwest, and in particular Indiana, to you. In fact, it was far more recognizably the industrial, post-rural mess of a place you knew than any of the, quote, Midwestern, quote, writers you'd read. This was like Joyce or Woolf or Barth or Bartlemy, not Tarkington or Riley. And what was this thing you just read? Was it an essay, a story, a collection of lyric paragraphs, a collage? What would you call it? We read it silently and aloud to ourselves over and over until, yes, one person in a group of Midwestern fiction writers can say, "So I have sailed the seas and come to be a small town fastened to a field in Indiana." And someone else will pick up on one lawn, there's a wood or plastic iron deer. And a third, the railroad that guts the town has straight, bright rails which hum when the train is coming, and the train itself has a welcome horning sound, and everyone says, weather. In the Midwest, around the lower lakes, the sky in the winter is heavy and close, and it is a rare day, a day to remark on, when the sky lifts and lets the heart up. I'm keeping count, and as I write this, it is 11 days since I have seen the sun. Boom. Gass wrote the story when he lived in Battleground, Indiana, outside of West Lafayette, or was it Brookston? There are different stories about that. He's trying to love this place he's found himself in and finds beauties and reflections in the store windows and the fields, but he's also horrified by much of it. He quotes from an 1833 preacher in a story, a quotation. Is this preacher a real person? Ignorance and her squalid brood, a universal dearth of intellect, total abstinence from literature is generally practiced. He quotes Plato. The entire story is an argument with Yeats' poem Sailing to Byzantium, and yet, there's the place itself, the offending electric wires, the weather, the winter gray. Shouldn't you love it? Shouldn't he love it? And finally, if the spirit is separate from the body, as Yeats writes in his poem, and it can go on singing when the dying animal cannot, there wouldn't be a problem. But the body is all of who I am, the narrator says, and so the town is part of this body. The spirit can't separate itself from the place. He wants to believe that up any staircase is another world, that there is enough to stir our wonder anywhere if one is strong enough, if one is diligent enough, if one is perceptive, patient, kind enough. Whatever it takes, he writes, and surely it's better to live in the country, to live on a prairie by a drawing of rivers in Iowa or Illinois or Indiana, say, than in any city, any stinking fog of human beings and any blooming orchard of machines. It ought to be, and man is not a fitting companion for man, he argues, and people in cities have nothing natural by which to measure themselves, and the rural Midwest is a lie of poetry.
Here are two passages from In the Heart of the Country by William Gass, published by New York Review Books. Wires. These wires offend me. These trees were maimed on their account, and now these wires deface the sky. They cross like a fence in front of me, enclosing the crows with the clouds. I can't reach in, but like a stick, I throw my feelings over. What is it that offends me? I am on my stump. I've built a platform there, and the wires prevent my going out. The cut trees, the black wires, all the beyond birds therefore anger me. When I've wormed through the fence to reach the meadow, do I ever feel the same about the field? Vital data. There are 2 restaurants here and a tea room, 2 bars, 1 bank, 3 barbers, 1 with a green shade with which he blinds his window, 2 groceries, a dealer in Fords, 1 drug, 1 hardware, and 1 appliance store, several that sell feed, grain, and farm equipment, an antique shop, a pool room, a laundromat, 3 doctors, a dentist, a plumber, a vet, a funeral home in elegant repair, the color of a buttercup, numerous beauty parlors which open and shut like night-blooming plants, a tiny dime and department store of no width but several floors, a hutch, homemade, where you can order, after lying down or squirming in, furniture that's been fashioned from bent lengths of stainless tubing, glowing plastic, metallic thread, and clear shellac. An American Legion post and a root beer stand, little agencies for this and that, cosmetics, brushes, insurance, greeting cards, and garden produce, anything, sample shoes which do their business out of hats and satchels, over coffee cups and dissolving sugar. Here's our conversation about this story and life and writing in the Midwest.
I'm Susan Neville. I am a fiction writer and nonfiction writer. My latest book is The Town of Whispering Dolls. I'm a native Hoosier, I guess, and I teach at Butler University in Indianapolis.
I'm Adrian Matejka. I used to be the Poet Laureate of the state of Indiana, but I'm not anymore. It's somebody else's job now. I grew up here, went to high school and college here. I've lived in Indiana for most of my life, and I teach at Indiana University in Bloomington.
And I'm Kevin McKelvey. I'm a poet, but also dabble in fiction and nonfiction and social practice art and a lot of other creative mediums. I grew up in Indiana, out in the country. Went to college here. I left the state by moving to Illinois for a few years, and then moved back. And I teach at University of Indianapolis.
How about we start by talking about why this story is so important and why it really has stuck around for so long as a story that's over 50 years old that really makes a difference for Hoosier writers and writers everywhere right now.
I think it was a really important story to a lot of Midwest fiction writers because it came at just the right time, of a certain generation. It was published, I think, in the 50s, early 60s, when many Midwestern fiction writers of around kind of my generation were reading the only models we had of people who were writing about a place we knew, writing about it in a way that had no connection whatsoever to what we actually saw and wasn't particularly good. So suddenly you have Gass appearing and writing about a small town in Indiana, and you can't tell whether the piece is, intended to be a short story or an essay or a collection of short, lyric poems, almost beautifully written. It's in, conversation, not just with other Midwestern writers, but with Yeats sailing to Byzantium. It, was an experimental piece, very like Joyce or Woolf were writing about Indiana, and it was thrilling. So I think it had a very large impact on a lot of Midwestern writers, not just writers from Indiana. It's an important 20th century artifact, I think, that's just been very influential. In the story, I think of so many lines from it every winter. He is expressing how the outside, how the landscape affects us emotionally, and then how we shape the landscape because of that. I mean, there's the line in the Midwest around the lower lakes: the sky in the winter is heavy and close, and it is a rare day, a day to remark on when the sky lifts and lets the heart up. I am keeping count as I write this. It is 11 days since I've seen the sun, or that wonderful list. He's constantly going back to the weather, where, everything is gray. The buildings, the roofs, the limbs of trees are gray. Streets, sidewalks, faces, feelings, they're gray. Speech is gray, and the grass where it shows. Every flank and front, each top is gray. Everything is gray. Hair, eyes, window glass. And it goes on. It's a long kind of litany of that frustration we often feel in February. But at the same time, he asks himself, shouldn't there be enough to love anywhere? Sometimes I feel like if I walked up that stairway, there'd be something, at the top. It would be another world. And he's trying to, shouldn't I love that I'm living in this rural area? And it strikes to how I think we feel in this particular place.
Some parts of my family have been here in Indiana for almost 200 years. There's a spot of ground we still have in Tipton County. And my family's been there almost a century. It's just a couple acres. But even that couple acres is fraught with economic opportunity and lack of opportunity. That's in the middle of a sea of industrial agriculture. In Indiana is this kind of wildly beautiful place. We don't have mountains or oceans. We do have an inland sea at our northern border, But most of that beauty has been cut down or drained. So there's a lot of wild beauty in Indiana. A lot of we have southern swamps in the south, northern forest in the north. These amazing deciduous trees, and most of that's gone now. And I think what kind of with the story, what strikes me is it's really captures this important time in the Midwest, kind of that 1920s to 1950s, 60s, where you kind of all across the Midwest, a generation or two from full Indian removal, kind of the European capitalist system is fully in effect by the 1920s, which is when Gass was born in North Dakota. And I think it's really interesting. He was born in North Dakota, grew up in Ohio, and kind of always spent his life in the Midwest or in different versions of the Midwest. And so I think that the story, as well as the Peterson Kid, the novella in the book as well, really captures the Midwest, from that kind of fully realized version of what Manifest Destiny wanted it to be, for better or for worse. But then really by the 1950s, 1960s, that was gone or in the process of being gone. And he really captures that quite well in the story, just these small town dynamics that are there and that then, disappear even more by the time I came around and by my childhood in the 80s. Like I saw some vestiges of what he's writing about, but it was mostly gone by the 80s, and now it's almost totally gone in those rural countrysides. And so I think, kind of the exterior, interior, that's what I love about the Peterson Kid, but also the story in the heart of the country is you're just kind of, you're just alone in the country or in these small towns. So there is a lot of interiority. You have to live in your own mind because, there's not that many people to talk to. And so, I think it really captures that, kind of from a child's perspective, from an adult perspective as well.
It's easy in the Midwest to get obsessed with things like power lines and birds and all the things that it's a very obsessive story. And I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and I feel like maybe we as writers are able to express those obsessions, but I really doubt that we're the only ones who have them, obviously, so it comes out in our writing, but everybody else is probably thinking the same things or into the something that because they focus, you have so much opportunity to focus when you have a lot of space around those things and it's empty in a lot of cases, the way it is here. So the story itself, and you touched on this a little bit, but it is about this interior landscape that is a very lonely place for him. But it seems like a choice in a lot of ways, like that's the choice. And as we grew up here and lived here, we all maybe felt that sort of loneliness or being sort of separate, but I wonder sometimes if everyone feels that too, or if there are these other people who feel like they're part of it all and we just maybe didn't.
We have such a complicated connection. I have my husband has a cousin who is a mayor of a small town in Indiana. She went to Brown University and she got her MBA at Harvard. And she said when she lived on the East Coast, that she felt like there was something on her that she could never quite get off. There was some kind of rural Midwestern thing that, people would always, like, she never felt comfortable. And she, lived then in San Francisco, and she still felt like, people would like kind of think, you're not really that smart or, whatever. And so she didn't feel comfortable there. Then she came back to her small town, became mayor, and she didn't feel comfortable there because nobody, they didn't quite trust what they thought was probably an elitism because she went to Yale. So she, absolutely she's like a woman without a country. And she says her friends from the East Coast and from Silicon Valley, she worked out there for a while, they don't come to visit her, or if they do, it's in a van to like show their kids, like a zoo or something. Like, here is what is the Midwest. Isn't it strange? And so, I don't know, we probably all are kind of insiders, outsiders, and maybe I can't remember who said it, everyone in Indiana kind of feels that way. Like, who are we? You have to be who you think I don't know. It's very strange.
When you were saying that, I was thinking about how, I grew up in Indianapolis, and so I lived on the east side, out on 42nd and Midhofer in this Section 8 housing, and it was very crowded and bustly. There were lots of kids my age kind of running around. And then we moved out to Pike Township on the northwest side when it was just being built up and there was nobody around. And all of a sudden we were in this suburb with 5 or 6 houses that I could walk to, and these big fields and forests and all of that stuff. Like Kevin was talking about, all of it's gone now. It's all been raised for strip malls and car washes or whatever. But there was it was a wild experience to go from this place where I felt like I was in the middle of a community and kind of a little hive to going out there where there was just nothing. And so this, this beautiful interior that William Gass creates in this story reminded me so much of being out in Pike Township early on. I think the section was My House, when he's talking about the trees being raised for power lines and things like that. That spoke so directly to me as the suburb was being built up around me, right? Things just, one day there would be a tree and then the next day there wouldn't, because they were getting prepared to put something else in there. And how that felt like not only isolation from people because there was nobody out there, which is, of course, is the point of the suburbs, but also isolation from the environment, right? Like they continued to push that away from us as well. So it's really complicated. Yeah, I mean, this is such a timely story and also timeless, right? Like the things that he's working through are still complications that we work through now.
In the story, he talks about how, the isolation and everything turns us in upon ourselves. And I grew up in near, sort of not, well, kind of near Lawrence Township, Castleton. I've always kind of lived in that area. And I remember when there were no shopping malls, and one of the most beautiful places in the city is where Castleton Mall is now. I mean, there were 100-year-old beech trees. It was gorgeous. And you could kind of still feel, gosh, I'm old, but you could kind of still feel the swamp in the weather, I guess sometimes we still can in the summer. But what interests me about what you said about, you watch it all change and all disappear, and you still have a sense that you've really lost something, but you don't know quite what it is. And also, I wonder if that says something about our current moment and, how split we are as a state politically, because, if you are living in a kind of isolated area and you're turned in upon yourself, it's so much easier to become involved in conspiracies and stories. And, I don't know. I've never thought about how the difference between towns and, and spaced out areas and that feeling of isolation has to kind of affect your imagination.
Yeah, there's a great book called Trickster Makes This World by Lewis Hyde, and he talks a lot about how tricksters kind of live on the edge of humanity. And that's, in some ways, I feel like that's where the best artists come from, are those people who lived kind of on the edges, kind of in these between spaces of human culture. And, that can be natural areas, like subdivisions on the edge of farm fields, like those of us who kind of lived between classes or cultures or various ethnic groups. And, I feel like that's kind of something that is at play in the story, because the narrator chooses this town, and we know, and Gass actually lived in Brookston and for a while, and so it is his town, but the narrator chooses his town, and he's very much an outsider in that town, as happens. I mean, another great term is dominator culture from bell hooks, and I think that dominator culture is very much at play in Indiana, everywhere in Indianapolis and the townships and the suburbs and these little 1,000-person towns, very much, like all these embedded class structures, whether that's landowners or churchgoers or the bankers or the doctors or those kinds of things. But, those class structures are inherent to Indiana, no matter where you are. And, I think some of the issues that Gass points out with those in the 50s and 60s have only gotten worse, have only grown more divided, as these towns or rural townships have depopulated. And that depopulation started a century ago. He writes about it, the farmers who moved into town in the 19-teens or early 1900s, built a big house. He's already talking about how that housing stock is changing and the nature of the town is changing, and that only grew worse or different, or more so over the next 50 years.
I loved the way he talks about how what you're left with, that something's lost, and he calls the gym, the church. Friday night basketball becomes, the expression of kind of spiritual wonder and people trying so desperately to kind of stay together through all those lists of the Knights of Columbus and, different clubs and things like that, where everyone just has, I think it's universal.
There's something really beautiful about that too. That kind of that manifestation of sport and the next generation being the thing that pulls everybody together. It makes me think about that. There's a really beautiful poem from James Wright, who was another deeply Midwestern writer. That poem "Autumn" begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. If y'all know that one, where he's talking about football being that thing that brings everybody together, right? But this is Indiana. It's not going to be football. It's going to be basketball. But you can see at those games, all of the complications play out, right? Like all of the sort of inter-community fights that are happening, get sort of manifested inside of those spaces, even on the weekends. This might be just me. Right. Like I said at the beginning, I teach at IU, but I live in Indianapolis, so I have to drive back and forth a couple times a week. And when I drive through and have had the displeasure, like the misfortune of being stuck in Martinsville for construction or whatever it's been for the last 2 years, I look around that town and it looks like it's 1950 still. And I'm not saying this as like taking a shot at them and their sort of racist past. I'm saying it just something about that space feels like they've worked really hard to keep it what it was. You know what I mean? And if you go to sort of like Franklin, Indiana, it feels like it might have felt in 1950, but it's sort of open and inclusive. And hey, guys, we have this great bookstore, and we have a little candy shop here and a cafe. Come and hang out. Right. Martinsville doesn't necessarily feel that way. It feels very insular to me, in the way that the stories, the towns that William Gass is talking about often do. Right. Like they've got their own terrarium-like kind of movement that happens. I think about this a lot while I'm driving through. Like, what is this, and what does this signify? In 21st century Indiana, like what is this saying that these spaces still exist? Yeah, there were times where I felt like, sure, I'm a Hoosier, but I'm a particular kind of Hoosier that belongs in Indianapolis or in Gary or in Evansville or something. Mostly my experience as poet laureate was so it was wonderful. I mean, it was exhaustingly wonderful, and I was invited to read and to teach and have conversations in places in Indiana that I would have never really expected to be welcomed. And at the same time, I mean, I think I was pretty aware, and I didn't talk about it then because I was trying to be, professional or something. But I can talk about it now. When I was being invited in some of these spaces, I mean, it was such a wonderful experience. We had great conversations, but also I understood that I'm in this town with the people who want to talk to me and want to hear from me. Right? They want to talk about poetry. It's a very self-selecting group. Right. So I wasn't actually in town. That's where the sort of insider outsider part of it came to me. I was visiting and I got to see just a little bit of what this community was like. But I was seeing the part of the community that already liked poetry. You know what I mean? Like they're out on a Wednesday evening wanting to talk about Mari Evans or something. Like that's a very specific part of their community, not the rest of them. And the reverse of that was when I went to a town that, just out of respect for these children, I won't name the town, but I went to a very rural, very agrarian town and ran some workshops at a middle school. And we had so much fun, like had them drawing pictures and writing poems, and we just had a blast. And then afterward, they took me to lunch. The principal took me to lunch at this like local diner. And as soon as I walked in, the entire place stopped. Everybody stopped and watched me walk in, and it was this thing like somebody just ripped the needle off the record. And we sat down and everybody was still just staring at me like, I actually had horns coming out of my head or something. And then the owner of the place came over and started talking to me, and everybody kind of went back to their business. But it was one of these moments where I was like, your children are so extraordinary. And they didn't even blink to see this black man in their town. But I come here to get a chicken, like a fried chicken salad, because I still ate meat back then, fried chicken salad, and everybody stopping and dropping their forks. So the two things exist at the same time. But as we all know, they're also, it's not hereditary. It's these very, very much learned biases. And so their parents haven't gotten to them yet. They haven't gotten to those kids because they were just hyped that somebody asked them to write a poem and draw pictures. They didn't care who it was. So I think, in just like any place, these things exist simultaneously. And I was lucky to get to see some of it in safety. You know what I mean? Like I wasn't there where people were going to come after me in some kind of weird, sundown town kind of way. I was there in the middle of the daytime being sort of chaperoned by the principal of the school. So yeah, it was something else. And wherever those kids are, I hope they're doing great.
My husband is from the area around Columbus, and so I write about a lot of this, small towns around Columbus, like Nineveh, and there is a feeling, and I think it comes from people who live there. Again, stories that have been passed down and things that there's just something lost. It's the natural landscape, or it's in many cases it's like industrialization came in like this giant tornado and changed agriculture and gave them all jobs for a while and then left, and so there's this kind of boiling rage, I think, that adults, and it's not as much in children, obviously, don't really quite know, what to do with.
That sort of turning inward that happens because of those external pressures, right? Like, what are we going to, how do we protect ourselves and how do we protect our spaces? And I think in cities, you see it neighborhood by neighborhood, right? But, in towns, like the entire town kind of rallies. I mean, I don't mean to be taking shots at all about Martinsville, but I just remembered that at some point I gave a lecture to the librarians, like a librarians association. And I made a joke about not wanting to stop in Martinsville. Like, it was pretty innocuous and I just kept it moving. And one of the librarians from Martinsville came to me after and was like, you know what, when you say those kinds of things, it sort of, validates the stereotypes of our town. I'm like, well, these aren't stereotypes. This is what your town is like. Then she said, well, but we're working to try to change it. I said, well, that's good. Keep working. But, I'm not the problem. It's some of your library constituents that are the challenge. Right. And so, even inside of those communities and in their insularness, there are people who were actively working to try to figure out a way to open them up some more. It's just that, if you have 10,000 people and there are only 3 trying to do that or something, or 5, it's very difficult to activate a kind of change in a small town when all of those other pressures that Susan's talking about and like financial and economic and social pressures are pushing down, making people want to kind of circle the wagons or whatever metaphor we're going to use for that.
So when we think about all these things and about the insider outsider aspect, the one thing we've talked about a little bit is that there are people like Gass who were temporary Hoosiers, where they just came here, worked for a while, and then moved on. All of us are born and raised here, but we have friends and colleagues who are the temporary Hoosier kind of folks. So how have we heard from them about their experience, and how important is it for us in Indiana to have these new perspectives and have visitors who come and live here for a while and then move to St. Louis or New York or wherever they go?
Well, in some ways we're all visitors because we're living on Native American land, and that genocide that allows us to live here is a big part of the state. I mean, we're named after Native Americans. Most of the city names are either Native Americans or people who killed Native Americans. And so I think in some ways I've always felt temporary. Part of that history is that I've been here my whole life almost. And, so some of that temporary feeling I have is that history of the land, the history of the place. And my family's, we have history here, but we've always kind of moved on, we've kind of moved around within Indiana. So I grew up near Lebanon, but I didn't, but my mom grew up around Tipton and my dad grew up in South Bend. And they had come from, and their families had come from other places too, either Southern Indiana or Kentucky. And so I think that shifting around is something I feel pretty acutely, even though I've never moved away. And so, in some ways, that's sort of like not being a temporary Hoosier means you have kind of multiple generations in the same place, maybe some accumulated land or wealth that allows that, which then kind of turns into not wanting new people to show up or move in. But we know, culture works because new people show up with new ideas and new experiences. And, and I think Indiana is pretty slow to adapt, but a lot of these small towns, with a growing Hispanic population, for example, they know, the town leaders know they need these new people living there. They may not be white, they may not speak English, but that's how the town's going to survive, and that's how the town's always survived. Whether it's Irish or Italian or whoever's showing up, that's how these towns have always survived, by new people moving in and people moving on.
I like that a lot. It reminds me, I was thinking about that section of William Gass's story, that vital data section, where he sort of lays out all of the parts of the town and, like 2 barbershops or whatever, and how that has to naturally change when another community is introduced, like another group of people are introduced into the town. I lived in Elkhart for a minute, for a year, right after college. And my girlfriend was from there, and we went up there. And I used to bartend at this place called the Hacienda. It's like the Mexican restaurant with no spice, and this sort of bowl of tomato sauce as salsa. Great chips though. anyway, so when I was there, the primary industry, and I don't know if this is the case anymore, but back in the 90s, the primary industry in that area was building RVs, right? Like these recreational vehicles for miles. And it was Elkhart and Goshen were these two sort of hubs for Holiday Rambler and those kind of things. They didn't have enough people to work in the factories to build the RVs back then. You do I remember people were making 15, 16 bucks an hour, like out of high school back in like 1995, right? We were making a ton of money working in these RV factories. So they just, to try to get some additional labor, they put advertisements in the newspaper in El Paso and other cities in Texas. And within 2 weeks, there was this mass migration of like 10,000 Mexican workers to the area. So all of the sudden, you have this town that was predominantly white, and then just, a third of the population of the town is suddenly of Mexican descent primarily, right? And they did not have any idea of how to manage this new community and this new population at first. But within about a month, there were these sort of, I don't know, I guess we used to call them mixers, but these kind of parties that would pop up at, somebody would rent out a room, like the ballroom at the Holiday Inn, and have a party that was catering toward the Mexican community, right? And they started doing things like that, trying to figure out how to take advantage of these new workers and these new earners. But it took a while. And that was, and the capitalism got to it much more quickly than the sort of social version of it, right? Like people trying to make money were there really quick for those workers, but the people who were trying to invite them into their churches and to their homes, that was much later. There was a lag in the sort of community acceptance, but boy, people were ready to make money. They were quick to hire the workers, and they were quick to figure out ways to get that money right back. Capitalism.
In terms of this story and, what we're talking about, our social elements of our communities and our state, there's an artistic quality to this story that kind of takes things in new ways, like Susan mentioned at the beginning. So there's a lot of that quality to this story here, where the paranoia and the fear is all really self-directed, and it's all based on simple things, which is really when surrealism works the best. It's not taking these extreme weird things and putting them in together. It's taking normal everyday things and twisting them into weird things. And that's kind of how we've lived our lives in Indiana. It feels like where we see these everyday things, but they're strange, and we see the strangeness in them and how they're turned around. Can we talk a little bit about how the surrealism of this story and the otherworldliness of what William Gass is pointing out connects with our experience here as people who are paying attention to life?
Well, I grew up on the edge of a cornfield, and it's just a very surrealist place. I mean, you can see forever, miles and miles and miles. I mean, I could see my elementary school growing up, and it was like 5 miles away, because it's so flat. And so, and then there's, and you're there's just strange things, like an animal shows up in your yard, or some dead thing, or something flies by. And then there's just the surprises of what other people do. And so I think, I think a lot of that surrealism just comes out of creating your own culture, or just processing what you see around you. Because you see some, pretty profound things, life and death and birth and regeneration and things that are floods, tornadoes, just like all the wild things that happen here in Indiana, I think just kind of contribute to that feeling of surrealism and just juxtaposition. We were mentioning earlier, like the four of us on this talk got obsessed with words, but it's like everybody like they got obsessed with quilts or canning or small engines or just a barn full of some crazy thing. And that's kind of all over, like my grandma's neighbor growing up had peacocks, 4 or 5 peacocks, and they kind of wander around out in the fields and the gardens, and it was amazing. I mean, just peacocks in the middle of nowhere. And I think that kind of thing happened, or somebody, it's on 32 between Lebanon and Westfield. Some guys got this whole pasture full of old farm equipment and like dinosaurs he's welded together, and that stuff's everywhere, just like these kind of like personal collections of whatever. And so, so I think the surrealism comes from you processing your own experience, but then you just, because there's space and because, there's all this room for self-expression and in many forms besides what we would consider art. I think those surrealist experiences and those juxtapositions are everywhere.
Whenever I'm writing nonfiction, I mean, in Indiana Winter, or in my book about factories, fabrication, you just go out someplace and be like, I mean, in Batesville, there's a guy who spends all day making these wooden, figures of Christ, and it's right across from a casket factory. And in right outside Columbus, there's a farmer who collects hornets' nests, and his house is filled with old hornets' nests, and makes all these great things out of 2-liter Coke bottles. And you just go out there and you just see it. And when I write fiction, I have been unable to write a realist story for years. I mean, if I'm thinking about it, it's the slippage, I think, because maybe everything does seem so the same all the time. It's like if you're in a desert, you see mirages or something, because you have to like fill in the space. And so, I think about young women in a small town, turning to prostitution because of the opioid epidemic, and I guess, suddenly I just see them as dolls. There's just something that makes it, I don't know, everything. It's like kind of wondrous or something to make that, to slip into, well, it's like we're living in Kansas and all of a sudden it's like, oh, Oz, I see it. Oz, it's right there.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I was thinking that one of the things that this piece does so well. I mean, there's the beauty of the form that he's using in these vignettes that, like Susan said, are kind of poems, kind of essays, kind of stories. Like there's all these different things at once. I love that part of it so much. But not to sort of word nerd out, but it's also the pacing of this piece that feels so decidedly Midwestern to me. It feels very much like that. And I think we've all been to New York City. And it's the worst example because it's sort of the fastest city to deal with. But when you're there and everybody's walking so fast and they're all like on this mission, even my friends who are from the Midwest and moved there get sped up by this place. It's like almost like you have to, turn up to 11 to be able to survive somehow. Right. And every time I go, especially for an extended period, I'm like, I do not care. You're not making me go fast. So I'm walking slow on the sidewalk and people are spilling all around me, mad, looking at me like, what's wrong with this guy? And I mention all of that because I think something about the pace of the Midwest, the pace of Indiana, especially in small towns, allows for a kind of wonder, right? Like you're able to sit there and think about the world differently and look across the cornfields or, to the school and spend the time languishing in those moments. Some people are like incredibly bored by that kind of action. But for those of us who really sort of walk around the world paying attention to it and being, in part to not be overwhelmed by it, having that space and having that kind of pace in the world is a good thing. You know, I could never live in New York City, not only because it's just super expensive, but because I don't want to go that fast. Like, I don't want to always be on the schedule and on the clock that's been created by other people. You know, I want to be on my time so I can linger and think about the world in this way that allows me to think of the hyperreal and to think of the surreal instead of just dealing, you know, the train leaves at 10:10. I got to get there, you know.
I love the section in the story that when he suddenly is just overwhelmed in the sensuality of bees and apples. It's like, and that I think comes from his, you know, just the isolation does either create numbness or it creates a kind of hyper awareness. And in his case, it's just a hyper awareness that eventually, you know, you know, toward the bees section comes toward the end, and it's just all this beautiful kind of just too muchness almost.
Another one of those examples of this story being timeless, you know. I mean, because it really is, it's embedded in the story, that isolation and that kind of longing and loneliness is built in to these vignettes. And it's so, yeah, it's it's something that I'm much more familiar with now than I was last March.
I mean, I'm thinking of the tree like the trees that get cut down, like you've seen those trees topped, but then he climbs them and kind of uses them as this way to kind of look out over the valley. And, you know, I just thought that was a kind of really interesting part of the story, that sort of isolation, but then kind of using the space that you have to kind of see or experience other places. You know, there's not, you know, I think there's a certain lack of mobility we have in the Midwest. It's less now, but it seems like he's capturing that, and he's capturing a time when these towns were self-contained. You know, they had everything you needed was in the town, and this is kind of right before three things that really kind of did a lot of these towns in. You know, the consolidation of schools happened right after or kind of during or after these stories were written. The introduction of interstates, which kind of pulled things towards the interstates or into the towns where the interstate ran, and then the loss of train service. You know, like these towns still had passenger service and freight service up through the 60s, and so, you know, all that kind of ended very quickly. All kind of basically happened at the same time in the 1960s into the early 1970s, and so. You know, in a lot of ways, this really captures that lived experience it's in some ways gone. Like those lists of all the social organizations. I mean, every town, like now all that's maybe in the county seat. Whereas when the story was written 50 years ago, you know, that sort of cultural, I don't know, milieu, you know, that culture was present in 5 or 6 little towns, not just the main. Not just the main county seat.
As we wrap up this conversation, let's talk a little bit about how some of the things we've talked about here fit with other Indiana writers we'll explore in the series. People like Mari Evans, Etheridge Knight, Marguerite Young, Kenneth Rexroth.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's going to be integral to our conversations as we go forward, and will be a really useful thing to think about, is the different kinds of Indiana that we're going to be seeing in these writers, right? I mean, the version that William Gass that applies to William Gass's piece or Marguerite Young might not really apply to the version of it in Mari Evans' poems or Etheridge Knight's poems, since they are coming from a tradition that is less about place. Like hardly any of it really has to do with place. It has to do with identity and politics and uplift. And so much of that is kind of, I don't want to say past the geographic aspects we're talking about, but it is, like I said, less concerned with it, right? And it's part of a much larger tradition of literature that connects across cities and across artists, through the Black arts movement, it gets spoken about as a thing of that was taking place in the cities, and that's certainly true. But what needs to be talked about maybe a little bit more is that it was taking place in Midwestern cities, Chicago and St. Louis and Indianapolis and Detroit in particular, right? So in almost every other, seems like almost every other literary movement in the U.S. somehow is connected to New York City, maybe because the publishers are there often, right? But it always feels like when we talk about major poetic movements, at least 3 of the people are from New York, right? But that was not the case at all with the Black arts movement. They were almost all from the Midwest. And so they're talking about this, even though they're not talking about geography, they can't help but be talking about geography because they're all sharing a similar Midwestern ethos.
Marguerite Young in particular is, she wrote an essay called The Midwest of Everywhere. And I can't remember exactly the line, but she was very, very consciously trying to bring in modernist techniques, as Gass was, and also and surrealism. And she in The Midwest of Everywhere, she talks about Indiana being a very surreal place, and she has her lists of things that you could go out and and see if your kind of eyes were open to them. And she's also, I think, a writer that we don't usually read or necessarily associate. And if you ask someone, give me a list of canonical Indiana writers, unless you really are a kind of student of Indiana literature, most people I don't think would mention Marguerite Young or William Gass. So I think they have, that kind of connection, and their sensibilities are quite very, very similar.
Let's listen to Susan reading a couple of excerpts from The Midwest of Everywhere by Marguerite Young, published in Mademoiselle magazine 1945. Then a couple more excerpts from In the Heart of the Country.
It is impossible to put a fence around the Middle West and say, here it is. Impossible from a creative point of view. The new writer of the Middle West, like the old writer of the Middle West, like Mark Twain and James Whitcomb Riley, sees, though there is a raucous comedy in it all, the tragic interplay of time with space, and no region, no reasonable locality. Even our Middle Western humor has been colored by a profound doubt. Mark Twain, under his rippling laughter, felt the coldness of the universe. James Whitcomb Riley, our children's poet, drank to forget the children. The new writer of the Middle West will be, like the old, the critic of life. Indeed, life, he will seem to say, is an endless, intricate criticism of itself. The Middle West slides thus into a kind of philosophic space inhabited by crucial symbols. In fact, the Middle West is the most exuberant life of fantasy, going on in whichever way it can, and sometimes, as at present, against the most terrific odds. For example, a man who was never sick a day in his life went to bed one night feeling perfectly fine, and the next morning when he got up still feeling perfectly fine, he was dead. Though, of course, he did not know of his death, and none of his neighbors knew of his death, and everything was just as it had been before. He was seen, after he was dead, out mowing the grass. In fact, several people spoke to him, and he mentioned his daughter's eczema. "There's never more than 3 cherries grown on my old cherry tree," he said, as he had said before. Elephants used to browse on the banks of the Wabash far away, lifting their trumpets to the tops of the nut trees. The wildness of the land has never disappeared, away off the beaten track. What is strange is beautiful. What is beautiful is strange. There is always a chance, too, that the vision in this phantasmagoric land may be the one reality. Who could expect a smoke-colored elephant to be out strolling alone on a road between 2 sultry cornfields, an elephant larger than some people's houses? A traveling salesman thinking that what he saw ahead of him was surely an optical illusion, missed the elephant by an inch. In the Middle West, as elsewhere, so much of life is fiction. What Shakespeare and the barber in Kokomo, Indiana called the dream within the dream, the moving shadow shapes that come and go. Finally, to sum up what may have seemed a long, winding argument, everywhere is everywhere. There is nothing superficial about the Middle West, but a superficial, mediocre view of it. All exotic knowledges must be brought into relation with our subject, which is, finally, an amorphous geography, the Egypt of Indiana, the Indiana of Egypt, the Russia of everywhere, the human soul.
Weather. We're always out of luck here. That's just how it is. For instance, in the winter. The sides of the buildings, the roofs, the limbs of the trees are gray. Streets, sidewalks, faces, feelings, they are gray. Speech is gray, and the grass where it snows. Every flank and front, each top is gray. Everything is gray. Hair, eyes, window glass, the hawkers' bills and touters' posters, lips, teeth, poles, and metal signs, they're gray, quite gray. Cars are gray, boots, shoes, suits, hats, gloves are gray. Horses, sheep, and cows, cats killed in the road, squirrels in the same way, sparrows, doves, and pigeons, all are gray. Everything is gray, and everyone is out of luck who lives here. Wires, where sparrows sit like fists. Doves fly the steeple. In mist the wires change perspective, rise and twist. If they led to you, I would know what they were. Thoughts passing often, like the starlings who flock these fields at evening to sleep in the trees beyond, would form a family of paths like this. They'd foot down the natural height of air to just about a bird's perch, and they do not lead to you. If I walked straight on in my present mood, I would reach the Wabash. It's not a mood in which I choose to conjure you. Similes dangle like baubles from me. This time of year the river is slow and shallow. The clay banks crack in the sun. Weeds surprise the sandbars. The air is moist and I am sweating. It's impossible to rhyme in this dust. Everything, sky, the cornfield stump, wild daisies, my old clothes, and pressless feelings seem fabricated for installment purchases. Yes, Christ, I am suffering a summer Christmas, and I cannot walk under the wires. The sparrows scatter like handfuls of gravel. Really, wires are voices in thin strips. They are words wound in cables, bars of connection. I want to thank my co-hosts, Adrian Matejka, Susan Neville, and Kevin McKelvey, for their great insight during this program, and we also want to thank you for listening. Lastly, we want to thank Indiana Humanities for the grant that supports this show. But before we leave, we want to invite you to get creative yourself and share some writing with us. The assignment for this time is based on William Gauss's work, looking out the back at the landscape. So your assignment that you could send to us is to take a look out your window at Indiana, take a picture of Indiana, make a list of what you see, small things, medium-sized things, larger things. Just take that long list or a litany, turn that into what would be a paragraph or so. Maybe it's 10 words, 25 words, up to 150 words. And you can email that to us at info@bigcar.org. Again, that's info@bigcar.org. You don't have to think of yourself as a writer to give this a try. Just make a list, write it down, type it up, record it, send it to us. You could record yourself reading it on your phone and send the MP3 file, or you could just send us the text. Again, send us your short story or poem, whatever you want to call it. That's a list picture of Indiana to info@bigcar.org. And it may end up published on our website or put out on a future program on the radio. Thank you again for listening to Words and Music on 99.1 WQRT LP Indianapolis. Learn more about this program by visiting bigcar.org or WQRT.org.